Hi, everybody. This is Paul Sims once again. Thank you again for being here on time. Really appreciate that. Today's webinar is called Make Serious Gains in Adherence. And hopefully that's a topic which has energized a lot of you. In fact, I can tell you it's a topic that's energized a lot of you because we've got more than 700 sign-ups for today's session. And I'm obviously really pleased that we can deliver this. We're going to be talking about doing this by strengthening the patient-provider relationship. And before I introduce all of my other panelists, I just want to say a couple of words about what motivated us to tackle this session. I mean, non-adherence has genuinely reached epidemic proportions. It's a topic which seems to have, not as fashionable as it once was, but a study 3 years ago showed that pharma is losing an estimated $637 billion in global revenues down to patient non-adherence for medications for chronic illnesses. And that's obviously even before we get to the impact on patients themselves and not meeting their outcomes, etc. So, the reasons why this exists, it's still being discussed to this day. Lack of trust, regimen difficulty, unpleasant side effects, many different things. But we do know that this is not a lost cause, despite it being a topic that we've all focused on for several years now. It can be improved when the provider and patient relationship is strengthened. And we are very much looking to try and help today with formulating a new approach to non-adherence, one that clarifies that joint provider-patient responsibility, one that provides better communication, one that really works with our patients as partners going forward. So it's an important topic, and I'm very pleased to say that I've got some great people that are going to be talking with me. You can hopefully see their smiling faces on your screen right now. Just going to go through them one by one very quickly. So Haider, top left, is a good friend. He's also a digital sales and marketing leader. And I say that in a very genuine way. Haider's a real specialist when it comes to product launch and has done some really exciting things in quite a range of different companies. And as you can see, he's obviously now in a global head of digital marketing role, so has obviously got a technological bent, but he's obviously a great people person and understands the general mechanics of how this all works. So really pleased that you could join us, Haider. Thank you very much. Just under him, we have Lisa. Lisa deserves special commendation for being a late addition to today's lineup. So really appreciate you shuffling your schedule. Thank you so much, Lisa. She is the Vice President and Global Head of Patient Outcomes and Solutions at the Patient Solutions Unit within Sanofi. Works with Anne Beal, who many of you might be aware of. But she has over 20 years of leadership experience of her own. And she's had a lot of line management of large multidisciplinary global research staff and budgets, as well as her work in the patient area and clinical public health area that she has developed more recently. She's also been on our stages a few times, and we're really grateful once again, Lisa. Thank you for being part of this session and being with us. Over to the side, and we have John. I want to say a quick word about John and his company, SCIO Health Analytics, because SCIO have actually been a partner with us in creating today's session, and they've been an absolutely fantastic partner as well. Really enjoyed working with them to get today's session up and running, and they've been responsible for not just helping with the design, but also in getting everybody to come on board. So they're one of the reasons why we have such a great audience today. Thank you so much to John and your team. John is actually a specialist in creating and selling quantitative solutions in the pharma industry, and he's been responsible for global strategy and business development of the advanced analytics and commercial excellence solutions within life sciences at SCIO. So comes with a strong pedigree there, especially from the technology side. Dr. Janos Pensis is last but not least. He's from Gedeon Richter, originally trained as a physician, but but he is really a marketer with a strong focus on digital now. And I think you're going to hear very soon he's been doing some very interesting work in his company when it comes to adherence and using this digital transformation agenda to adopt meaningful stuff for patients. And I think some of the work has been really fantastic. So we've got a really good set of panelists, but as ever with these sessions, so much of how well this goes is actually down to you listening in. So what I would really like is for everybody here to make themselves aware of the questions box on the right-hand side of your screen. In fact, perhaps you could write a little hello in there right now so that I can tell that you're paying attention and you can actually hear me and you haven't fallen asleep already. Okay, good. Getting some hellos in there. That's always nice to see. So now you've obviously found it. Please do use it. I'd love to see, as I say, everybody asking at least one question during the next hour or so as we go ahead. Let's make it an interactive session. The very next thing that I'm going to do is actually to hand over to John, who I introduced earlier. John is going to present a few slides, which are going to very much set the tone for the rest of the session. And for some reason, just having a couple of issues unmuting you. There you are, John. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Paul. Yes.
Great,
you.
And we can hear you perfectly as well. So let me move to your slides.
Excellent. Well, first off, I want to say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all who have joined. Thank you for the time. Appreciate your interest in today's, as I like to call it, kitchen table discussion around adherence. We'll take a quick journey down a few introductory slides and then open the conversation up to some poll results. And then please, by all means, as Paul indicated, fire away with questions. That's why we're here. We'd love to have as much of an iterative conversation as possible. Paul, you can jump to the next slide.
Sure.
Thank you. So, what we see today, and one could argue this in multiple directions as to the reason why healthcare itself is in quote-unquote crisis mode. But one key reason, specifically here in the U.S., and I'm sure this happens abroad as well, is regarding non-adherence. It's a major source of waste in the U.S. It totals somewhere north of $290 billion, or about 13% of total healthcare spend, 2.3% of GDP. It's a relatively large number. Again, nothing surprising by these facts or figures, but what it does is it puts a tremendous burden on the ecosystem, and that translates into poor clinical outcomes, patients at this juncture not receiving the appropriate treatment or having to go through multiple steps of treatment until they find the right treatment, which segues into declining quality of life. Other conditions sort of peak up and affect these patients over time. And that drives into skyrocketing costs of care, of which most of the burden today is being placed on the patient, or as we like to call them, the healthcare consumer. And that, of course, drives also increasing insurance premiums. So there's sort of a never-ending spiraling effect that's taking place today. There's no one answer to this question, but what we see is this is happening and it's increasing over time. Paul, you can go to the next slide.
Sure. Cool. Yeah. Sorry.
So in terms of where we are, how this affects pharma companies, our clients and our universe, we're seeing or hearing of roughly $600+ billion in global revenue due to non-adherence for specifically around chronic conditions, a chronic illness. Now that was a couple of years back. So today that number, I'm sure, $637 billion is probably closer to 700 and change or $800 billion. It's a significant number. Now, in eyeforpharma in Philadelphia this year, one of our colleagues listed a handful of ways that manufacturers could claw back, if you will, some of those lost revenue dollars. Number one, obviously launch new products, of course. Two, have physicians write more prescriptions of the existing products. Three, raise prices. We've seen a lot of that, and that is a major issue. I think that's affecting the healthcare system over the last 24 months. But in four, get patients to take their meds as prescribed. Now, what's interesting about this is that it's, again, not one single answer that will help drive patient adherence and drive healthier patients, which then, of course, drive down the loss of some of those global revenues. What is interesting, though, is driving patients to take their meds as prescribed is the least of all four that are being done today or that are being addressed today. But it really should be at the top of the list. Again, the consumer today or the patient today is in fact the consumer. There's more information. It might be information overload regarding how to treat their condition, how to address the health effects of their condition, and how to ask the right questions when they are visiting their providers. But on the flip side of that, the question becomes, are the providers today also being armed with the right information to share with their patients? And one would argue the answer is yes and no. There's a lot of old line thinking of this is the way it's been done, this is the way we're going to move forward. There's obviously a line of thinking of within a health system, this is the way we approach care for diabetes or other chronic conditions with patients. But if you start to really listen to where the drive is at the patient level and at the cost level, I think we'll find that there's much more to it. Paul, you can segue to the next slide.
Sure.
What we're finding is a challenge of, okay, how do we get patients to take their meds as prescribed? Again, it really is up to the patients at the end of the day, but how do we help and guide them appropriately? We have an interesting approach, and we feel that this is an approach that has been warranted and used in other verticals, other industries for years and years now. For example, in the banking industry, in the retail industry, consumer retail industry, that is, they have tremendous amount of information at the consumer level, and they use it, right or wrong, wisely to truly identify and segment your behaviors, your buying behaviors, your attitudes, and how you approach, whether it be buying products in the store or online, or how you approach your personal financial planning, etc. Well, that same approach it has to be adopted with much stronger sets of data today that are available inside of the pharma space. So one of the things that we look at this sort of view here is looking at multiple layers of data to drive down to something that we call risk, or something we think about as called risk. The risk of the patient not complying or adhering to their medication, and as a result, what could happen to that patient over time. For example, will their health decrease, and what are the underlying reasons for it? Is it socioeconomic? Is it demographic? Is it utilization of services and or products? Is it cost and quality, just simply access to specific care? Or again, is it specific attitudes and behaviors that affect these patients? Understanding multiple layers of factors to come up with a true segmentation of the patients could help drive better adherence, better compliance for these patients moving forward. But also, if you understand the patient at the very granular level, and where more patients like them exist across specific geographies, that becomes quite a compelling story for the provider to share that information so that they can take advantage of how they communicate one-to-one with those patients. The beauty of the pharma space is that you have the direct line to the providers. Now, again, access aside, having those types of conversations are invaluable. As a matter of fact, I don't have the exact statistics in front of me, but not too long ago, a member of my team found some information, and I'll find it, Paul, maybe share it with you, maybe share it with everyone, that HCPs or providers here in the States, one of the key reasons why they prefer not to see sales reps is that there's nothing new to share from those sales reps to those HCPs. Well, the secondary question was, are folks able to share high-level insights of segmentations of patient types and or behaviors that are being treated for a specific condition? The resounding answer was no. There's nothing like that being disseminated or shared. So this is a playbook from, again, other industries that have used it quite successfully, but truly understanding who that patient is and what keeps them awake at night, for lack of a better word, from adhering to their medication, and then how to help drive that relationship between the HCP or the provider and the patient themselves. What programs can be put in place that could move that along over time? Paul, on the next slide, please.
Sure.
And this is just a general example generically speaking, of what a patient segment can look like. And apologize for some of the formatting there at the top, but this is a patient persona. We call this segment balanced adults. I always like to sort of jokingly state that, although this being generic, there's very few balanced adults out there. We're all deep down, we're all kids in different ways, but really understanding both, again, the socioeconomic, the demographic factors of these patients, combined with the clinical attributes of these patients, help derive future insight in the form of what we call a prospective risk and an impactability score. So those two are key components: understanding where are the patients headed in the next 12 months, and are they impactable, yes or no? What are those specific triggers that will allow for them to actually move in their terms of thinking toward adherence? And the underlying data, as you can imagine, there's a lot of data that are available out there in the world today, almost too much. But a lot of these data can be used to derive that score, those scoring. And then with machine learning technologies of today, we can continue to run models with updated data, and the model will generate and adapt to the changing behaviors and attitudes, both clinically and socioeconomically, of those patients and that patient-provider relationship, to then generate that score, which is moving north or south. So in this case, the higher the score, not good. The higher the score for the risk of the patient, not good, in the sense that they're sort of traveling closer to that cliff of comorbid conditions, driving up cost of care, and reasons why, again. But are they impactable? So can we actually get to them through our HCP channels, through our other education type of programs, to help shift the needle in advance before they move too far toward that cliff? So with that being said, Paul, next slide, please. What we find often is that we really can take advantage of these large sets of data in machine learning to understand the journey of the patient, or also what we call the waterfall effect of the patient. When they're diagnosed with a specific condition, can really follow that patient down the pathway of what products or what drugs were they used initially, or subsequent treatments, and where are they today? And that's a historical timeline, looking at comorbid conditions. What conditions are they? What treatments are they using to treat those conditions? And really following that journey of what happens along the way. What are the potential adverse effects that have affected that patient, and have driven up various costs and services throughout the system? Could those have been avoided from the very beginning of that journey, or somewhere in the middle of that journey? And what does that mean? That's an interesting conversation to start happening internally, naturally, once the data are available. But it also, as Paul mentioned on the early side of this conversation, a lot of payers today across the world are starting to challenge our clients, life sciences, with coming up with risk and outcomes-based agreements. Well, if we can start thinking about the journey of the patient and what happened throughout that journey, and specific key triggers of when that journey took place, and what key component drove the non-adherence component of that patient through that journey, that becomes invaluable information to start thinking about, again, from a risk perspective or an outcome perspective. How do we then tackle those patients together? and naturally through the provider channel in our universe, and with the actual payer through the actual patient channel themselves through some type of care program. That is a win-win. I know it's a heavy lift. We've seen it happening now slowly. It's taking place. But that is a win-win, which most important puts the patient at the center of that universe, and it puts the provider right beside those folks in terms of a joint effort to drive them to a better care, better treatment, and ideally better adherence. So these are some of the ways in which the universe is starting to migrate toward, again, very complicated behind the scenes in terms of the modeling that is done in the thinking process of what looks like in the next 12 months, predicting out into the future with a high degree of certainty. But it all boils down to a score, and a score of impactability and risk, and then the underlying reasons which really drive, or could drive, those patients toward better care, those providers toward better conversations, that collaboration, better collaboration, if you will, between payers and providers over time. There's a whole slew of other ways in which the data can be used, of course, but essentially at the end of the day, it's really about how do we keep patients or put patients on the right product at the right time, keep them there over time, and prove the value that if they are in fact switching or not adhering, what happens? How does that get communicated, again, through those appropriate channels? So with that said, I'm gonna stop here for slides. I think Paul has a couple of survey polls to share with the audience that I think some very good insights that I sort of feed into some of this conversation. But welcome questions.
Yeah, actually, thank you, John. Your first few slides have already stimulated quite a few questions. So before I move on to those things, I'm just going to read a couple out for you, if that's okay. And I have to say, a lot of people are in agreement with you. There's a lot of appreciation of what you're saying here. So obviously we've got an aligned audience here. But yeah, some questions. I'll just read out sort of three or so, and feel free to take what you can. What role do you feel retail pharmacy, specifically the pharmacist, in communicating the importance and the value to the patients actually has, and does that drive any of the trends that you've mentioned here? Are providers providing enough compliance items such as pill boxes to help patients take their medicines? A couple of comments, like it's easier for pharma to continue to raise its drug prices than spending to address non-adherence. That's in, I guess, the point to one of the earlier things that you said. A couple of people would love to know a bit more about the data sources that you used for the information that you shared. And by the way, a few people have asked for copies of the slides and this recording. We are recording today's session, and yes, it will be sent to you automatically in a couple of days' time. So don't worry, you don't need to ask me. You'll be able to listen back. You'll be able to share with your team, etc. So, sorry, one more question. I'll just read out. Has this been proven to positively impact outcome LT? I assume that means lifetime. Yeah, a few questions there.
Sure. Happy to address most of those questions. It's not as if we don't hear those very often. So thank you for the in-depth questions. First question regarding retail pharmacy. It's a great question. Short answer to the question: yes, absolutely. The pharmacist plays a critical role in this journey moving forward with regard to risk and outcomes. What we're seeing is when we're working directly with clients like Pharma clients and working on these types of analyses to provide better collaboration between pharma and payers, that third leg of the stool, in fact, becomes that PBM or that pharmacist that can disseminate the information. And that's happening directly between the payer and the PBM themselves through the analysis of the data. One of the key components, though, of this is the assessment. And as you can imagine, this is a long, complicated journey. One of the key questions that our clients are starting to ask: does the payer that you're working with and that is challenging you with outcomes and/or risks, do they have the capabilities to in fact affect that patient population? One, through their care programs, and two, through their PBM partner. Can they get the appropriate messages to the appropriate patients as identified by the analysis? Now, most of the answer is yes, maybe so. but are there ways? So that information that we're looking at here is then shared directly also with the retail pharmacy, naturally all anonymized, but it's shared with at that level. It's segmented by geography type, so it does give them that type of insight to understand that there are the vast majority of high-cost baby boomers or balanced adults are in these particular geographies. They act, think, and feel a certain way. These are the type of trigger messages that you want to share and provide to them when they approach that pharmacy counter. So it is a critical component. It's complex, but it is taking place. Another question was regarding data. As you can imagine, there's vast amounts of data being used to drive these analyses. One, as simple as possible, de-identified medical and pharmacy claims data that go back 5+ years, longitudinal-based data that encompass the whole view of the patient, not just for the condition at hand, but everything that has been diagnosed, treated along the way for that patient is a critical piece of the information. EMR and EHR data are, in fact, now becoming part of that equation too, as it's still, for lack of, it's still a bit of the Wild West with regard to that. There's a lot of information that are being transposed out of those written medical records. The question becomes, of which of those data are valuable to the equation? So we're exploring that as well. Not exactly needed, but again, as machine learning propels itself forward, the beauty of having additional data sets added to the mix to understand which variables are driving behaviors are critical. Lab data is another key component that are being used in all of this, of course, as indication and/or condition appropriate. And the other components to all of this are socioeconomic and demographic data down to very granular zip code level, understanding the patients from a demographic, socioeconomic perspective, and then also having that FICO or FICO-like credit scoring type of data. It's interesting looking at some of the similarities or not of credit scoring as done in the U.S. And the correlation to adherent and non-adherent patients. Are there correlations? Is it a compounding variable that drives behaviors or not? Or is it just one of three that are three key factors that then drive that what we call impactability score? So it's lots of data in that regard. Another question was, does this affect sort of, has this been put into place? So, these analyses are relatively new. In this depth, of course, with the machine learning capabilities of today. So we're a couple years in. We've got a number of clients that are using these data for various tactical purposes across the commercial spectrum, but then also various outcome and risk-based conversations to tackle the particular patient base. That's ongoing as we speak. We're typically not privy to the outcomes of that, but I can tell you that those clients are still with us and very happy and continue to think through this at different therapeutic areas to apply this based on those conversations. So something is working. On the other side, just to be blunt, on the payer side, our organization is well entrenched with payers. I can tell you that there is a need and a want in those organizations to have these conversations and dialogue. They're not as prepared as you think they might be to go deep on this type of analysis. Some are, of course, but most aren't. So they are truly looking for that sort of collaborative effect and kicking the tires on this. We're going to make mistakes along the way. It doesn't mean that we're going to kill the program, but we want to learn together because over the next 12, 18, 24 months, ultimately, we should see a rise in patient adherence and also a rise in, a decrease in patient costs. And if that proves us anything, if we claw back some of that loss of revenue on our side, and on the flip side, payer sees a loss of healthcare costs or decrease of healthcare costs, it's a win-win, and it's a tangible conversation that's happening now. We're starting to see a little bit of that trickle in. So I don't want to cannibalize the whole conversation, but I just want to try to address those questions. I can talk all day.
It turns out that during those last few minutes, you've had probably 15 more questions roll in, which we're obviously not going to be able to cover, otherwise we won't do anything else. But perhaps, John, I could send them to you post-webinar, and you might be able to provide some answers that we could share with the audience. Would that be okay in your point of view?
Absolutely, that would be great.
Okay.
I would be more than happy to. Sure.
Fantastic. Okay, well, sorry to those who've just asked questions just now. We do need to move on and make sure that we get through the discussion. As John mentioned not long ago, you might remember that when you signed up for this webinar, you actually answered a couple of questions as part of that sign-up process, and this is the results. So we asked two questions. The first one you can see in front of you: patient non-adherence can primarily be attributed to, and as we pointed out in our sort of pre-event discussion, this uneducated patient is taking on a massive 40% of the picture here, which is perhaps more than most of us expected. So I'd actually like to invite our panelists in, and I'm just having a couple of issues again with the unmuting of everybody, but hopefully everybody's on board now. I'd love to just hear perhaps a couple of comments on this from the panel. Janos, I think you had something to say initially on this one. Yeah.
Yes. Hello. Good afternoon, everybody. So actually, this was really interesting. This was a really interesting finding for me. Uneducated patient, almost 40%. I think we tend to just gravitate back to education in most of the cases, or in many of the cases when we try to address non-compliance, and perhaps it's I'll be blunt, maybe it's just a bit of a laziness on our terms, trying to ask the simplest questions, trying to get patients take the meds as prescribed. Maybe this is a very superficial question, and maybe we do have to acknowledge that non-compliance is just a symptom and not the diagnosis of what is really going on. So especially if we take a look at those figures which show, for example, one that really strike me is patients with glaucoma who were actually educated about the very grave effects of non-compliance. 58% of them still were non-compliant. And the shocking part was when I learned that actually those patients who already lost sight in one eye due to the disease, still 42% of them were non-compliant. So it's not just them being uneducated. It's a much higher level of even having the personal experience of going through the whole disease like this, and the experience level is of course much more profound. Still 45%. So there must be something many more factors in this, and I think we cannot really address this without talking about personalization and at scale. So, and just to add and this of course refers back to all of the slides that John was showing. My question, and the next step would be that, of course, we all know that HCPs are under constant time pressure. So if we try to take the next step in achieving better patient outcomes, trying to ask more profound questions, not just why don't they take their meds, or let's educate them to take their meds, but really understand why they don't take their meds, then HCPs will have to work in more detail and provide more engagement, more face time with patients, and so on. So the question becomes really how to address something that is very complicated in a way that can be simple, manageable, and providing a good user experience and sustainable even for the healthcare practitioners.
Yeah, and this is, if I may take the point, Janos, I think this is where, and it's Heider speaking. Hello, everybody. For me, it's where there are potentially no simple answer. It's a complex project or complex question that there might be only, multifactorial answers to it. And this is where we try, I think, for many years, more than 10 years now in this industry, I hear patient adherence quite a lot, but it's always coming back, like you said, on the education. And I'm asking myself within my company here, where do we have the most influence on those on this pie chart? What can we do quickly to really have an impact on having people live better lives? And this is where I can see maybe a little bit more into simplification, like you said, personalization medicine. But it is something that it is becoming more and more difficult to tackle, to go and put a program in place and try to roll it out. What I believe, though, what is the positive sign, more and more payers are putting pressure on outcome-based reimbursement or performance-based reimbursement model, which potentially will force us as an industry to think about this education or these programs that will help the adherence as a companion package when we develop a drug and roll it out. It will not be in our value dossier just saying we've done, the efficacy safety that is relevant for your market or for your pharmacoeconomics, but we are actually going a step beyond and living this patient centricity we hear so much of.
Yes, and this is Lisa. I would say that my reaction is this chart. Number one, it can't broadly represent what is happening specifically in context, right? So to say what's non-adherence attributed to in the United States, that ability to pay, that's probably a bigger percentage of the pie chart, for example. And then in certain disease states, there is more or less emotional context, which I don't see at all here in the pie chart. And it's interesting to me because the OECD report on non-adherence talked recently about the fact that we focus on education and patient-targeted interventions alone excessively without dealing effectively with the system factors such as, barriers to obtaining the medicines, barriers to obtaining refills, healthcare provider, patient communication, and so things like shared decision-making. So I think we have to examine the context of non-adherence, both in terms of what systems are we talking about and what patients and disease are we talking about in order to get deeper at the drivers and then target interventions accordingly.
Okay, some very good points there. As is common with most eyeforpharma sessions, we actually have some patients on the line as well, and I've had some comments from them saying that the scale of uneducated patients is not surprising at all to them and their travels, but also what about uneducated caregivers is obviously a key point there as well. Let's move on to the next graph. So this is the second question that we asked. What can pharma actually do to increase patient adherence rates? Well, we did talk about this very briefly just now as well, but as you can see, again, the educational side of it is fairly strong, but also just knowing and understanding is the highest, so good 35%. Interesting that offering actual incentives, etc., is deemed to be the lowest there. Any comments on that from the panel?
If I may start again, Janos here. Trying to avoid the silence. So actually here I was really surprised in a positive way, especially so about this green one, talking about the behavioral profiles. This somehow talks to the fact that we are now beginning to really go into those details where we try to actually understand the patients being experts in having the disease, as opposed to just asking why don't they take the meds. And this can really unearth very interesting findings if a pharmaceutical product manager actually meets patients and tries to put himself or herself in the shoes of the patients. That can really broaden the perspective of the work that she has to do in order to really help these patients. And I think one of the most profound finding that in one of our experience came out is that actually we had to realize that many of the patients, when talking about the medication, it was only a really, really tiny fraction of their concerns. While of course it is close to 100% concern for us within pharma, but if we take a look at how the patient perceives his from her point of view, it's only really a tiny amount of the whole concern. And there are so many other areas correlating to this one that we might get ideas to support in a more holistic way that can really of course, at the end of the day, also have a positive impact on patient adherence. But it's not just about asking, okay, sell more or have a better outcome by taking the medications, but it's much more like quality of life and meeting patients' needs on their terms and not on ours.
So I would agree with that. This is Lisa. I think that when we've seen things that are more effective, we've not only spoken with patients, but understood their goals and objectives for their lives and how they want to manage their lives and fit our products and manage their diseases so they don't impact or so they don't constrain the way they want to live. And also, we work with patients to co-create solutions that will help them manage their meds and their condition better. And so some of those are services, IT digital services, some of them are tools, some of them are tools to help coordinate with healthcare providers communication. So I think collaborating with patients on solving issues and developing services is also key.
And maybe just to come back, sorry, Haider, just one more thing. So just to come back to this strengthening the patient-provider relationship, this is also a very delicate issue. Not so long ago, Weber Shandvik and the KRC Research published a very interesting finding. The data comes from the United States, where they were researching how people get their health information and how much they trust the different sources. And they found that actually millennials who will, they have the biggest trust gap with their doctors. 38% of them said they trust their peers more than medical professionals. And 55% believe online health information is as reliable as information from a doctor. So these trends we must really take into account in the big picture. When we talk about behavior, there are big trends, but at the end of the day, I think when we try to help the individual, we must personalize really one-to-one.
It's a great point, and I think it also segues into a conversation of when you think about patient education. It changes your thought process, right? In terms of, well, what does patient education mean? Obviously, it means a lot. But what does it mean for millennials? And in that case, it could be simply as driving millennials toward the appropriate type of information that they would find online regarding a condition, and then of course having that ability to share with their peers versus listening to the MD. There's a tricky minefield to navigate there, but that's an opportunity from a patient education perspective, different than what we're typically used to today, which is the education coming from a payer and obviously from a care program, within one of our clients. But it's a different way to navigate that landscape. How does that then translate into Gen X folks and then possibly to boomers as well? How do they adapt and adhere to that as the line of thinking as well, or don't they? So now you've got another level of complexity.
There's two things. Number one, peers have been shown to be effective on other people's behavior for a long time, in everything ranging from the addiction space to shared experience in chronic disorders such as diabetes. So for a long time, we've used groups and peers to try to support each other to enhance adherence to lifestyle changes, to meds, et cetera. So I think that leveraging peers is not solely targeted at the millennials, although they may be even more peer influenced than others. And the other thing I would say is that the trust factor is really critical, and there are tools that have been used to help healthcare providers increase the trust with patients, because trust is highly associated with patient adherence. So some of that is helping healthcare providers communicate better, whether that's shared decision making in formal training programs or simpler tools that open the dialogue. Those kind of communication skills for healthcare providers are critical to enhancing trust as well.
Just
Okay.
if I may, coming back to your slide, John, you know, when you and just keeping it connected to this pie chart. If I was to prioritize here for us, at least what we saw is looking at this journey that that you map out, and in for us, for example, one example was the nurses, and working and empowering the nurses so that you educate the patient through an existing clinical practice. That was for us an easy win, you know, in this adherence approach. And if I look at this whole pie chart, effectively knowing the patient and collaborating with physicians are really the two, let's say, accessible initiatives that we embed. Educating the patients, it's usually coming back to reality, costs, programs, and are we the right ones as a pharma? Do we have the trust to actually be in front of the patients and really do this job very well? And this is the question that comes the most in my company.
Well, I'm actually going to ask the audience that question very shortly, Haida, so we'll actually see what people think. And in fact, that's what I'd like to move on to now, if that's okay. We've already gone through the vast majority of our time. And so what I'm going to actually do is something I've never done before. As you can see, what I'm going to do is actually ask the audience a succession of poll questions. We're not going to have the opportunity to discuss every single one. So what I'd like to do is maybe ask a few, and then obviously panelists and audience, feel free to jump in after we've asked them and comment on any of them. I can re-show the results of any of the poll questions. So why don't you take a look at your screen now for the first one? What are the biggest barriers for launching this? Can you? Sorry, my computer seems to be hanging slightly. Can you actually? Oh, sorry, things are going a bit funny on my side. Okay, for some reason that poll didn't work. I'm so sorry. I've got some couple of technical issues my side. That's a rather a shame. Okay, let's have a look at this poll question. Can you see that on your screen now?
Yeah, it works.
Okay. Sorry, I'm having some issues with my screen here on my side. But the biggest impact of patient non-adherence. So I'm giving you 5 options here. You might find it very difficult to select only one. I'm being a little bit mean and only giving you one to choose from. But what do you think is actually the biggest impact that you believe is caused from non-adherence? So a dent in company profitability, significant new expenditures on patient education, a failure to deliver on patient outcomes, a waste of sunk manufacturing and R&D costs, or goals unmet in outcomes-based contracts or other targets. So, right, audience, I'm going to need your full attention in answering these questions. I've got about 50% of you who've voted so far. We're going to do a succession of these, so full attention, everybody, if that's all right. We've got, that's creeping up. I'll hold it open for 3 more seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, let's have a look at the results. Thank you, everybody. Okay, so the results of this one are here. Nearly 2/3 are choosing the patient outcomes option, and a relatively minor option on all of the rest. So hold those results in your memory for a second, because I'm gonna, as I say, can move straight on to another question, and that question is actually about getting buy-in. Sorry about the screen issues at the moment. Okay, so when it comes to gaining senior level buy-in for adherence, what is the most persuasive argument? Is it the lifetime financial return on an adherent patient versus non-adherent, or the social impact of delivering on patient outcomes, or is it something else? So again, I'm forcing you to choose just one. By the way, if you write something else, and I can see that already a number of you have, can you please write into the question box what that something else is in your opinion? And then I can perhaps read a couple of those out if I get some conversation, if I get some contribution, should I say. Okay, 3 more seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, thank you, everybody. That's good. We've got even more people asking that one. Let's have a look at the results. Okay, so there's a contrast, isn't there? So patient outcomes was by far and away the most popular, yet in terms of actually getting the senior level buy-in, 2/3 of us, once again, same sort of number, roughly talk about the pure financial return on getting that there. And of course you can say, yes, I realize that the two can be the same, and I realize that's the argument that a lot of people will make, but it's very interesting that that's the one that people lead with when it is then they're actually trying to get support. And I know that from some of the conversations with the panelists pre-session, that's exactly how they felt as well. Okay, so I'm going to ask one more of these questions, which I believe is the question that Haida was just talking about as we finished the last section. So have a quick look at this one. Okay, have a look at that. Okay, so in the future, do you believe pharma companies should always take the lead in adherence initiatives? So I've given you 5 options here. Yes, as pharma has the most to lose or gain, and so should be in the lead. Yes, we should tie adherence initiatives to our brand and other initiatives to our brand, and that's very important for us. No, we should sponsor other groups who have more credibility, more trust with the patient community, and we should support them. No, we should actually be forming partnership coalitions including with other pharma companies that operate in the same therapy areas as we do. Or no, the initiatives should be completely led by trusted third parties and delivered by them as well. So I'm actually very interested to hear the results of this one. I think it could be very interesting indeed. I'll leave that open. I can see I've got about 60% of votes. 3 more seconds, everybody. 3, 2, 1. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. That's going to be very interesting. Let's have a look. Okay. So, quite a mixed bag, I would say. We have got a winner. We should form partner coalitions, which interestingly, when I was writing these things, I thought that would be probably the weakest. In fact, that was the one I almost had to brainstorm the most, shall we say. But that's a 35% with a good quarter of people or a fifth of people on the adherence to our brands and sponsoring other groups. There's a pretty wide range there, isn't it? I'm sure it sort of obviously varies with therapy areas and things like that. But that's a very broad range, I think, and clearly we don't know the answer to that one. Okay, so I'd be very interested to bring it back to our panel now, and obviously, audience, please feel free to throw in some more questions. But out of all of those 3 results, and I can share them back again if you want, anything that surprised you from the panel, anything you'd like to comment on? Silence. It shocked me clearly.
And for me, I can start. I mean, this is, you know what, for me, patient-provider, this patient-provider relationship when it comes to adherence is a very, very broad topic that's almost start sometimes from prevention. So it's kind of cascade from this patient-centricity, what do we want to do? And then you have always those big topics coming to the brainstorming table. And when it's nice to put them, with post-it and workshops and so on. When it comes to unlock and really go on the field and really go to walking the talk, this is where this financial piece is very hard. And I haven't found yet a model where a pharma, I'm sure some pharma in chronic disease are doing it well, but at least for my company, and we are, trying to find this perfect way of finding our place and really having an impact. It's not easy. When we recognize that you need to go talking to patients, the cost of running a direct to patient, direct to consumer program it's another level of involvement. And this is where it's coming back to change management ambition. And this is where we kind of forget about the impact of those big programs when it comes to adherence. It's not that easy.
Yes,
well, I would say
Sorry.
that from a medical perspective, we tend to focus on the outcomes. So not necessarily the social outcomes, but the clinical outcomes, because in order to deliver the value of the product, they have to be taken at least a reasonable percentage of the time as prescribed. So that's kind of our focus. But I would also say that I agreed with the last question, because it just depends. We're doing a range of activities, from things that are closely tied to brands to things that are unbranded initiatives, that are pure pharma, that are done in collaboration with patient groups, that are done in collaboration with provider groups and digital technology. And I would say that the promise of digital is increasing scalability at lower costs as we're getting more sophisticated at using digital to really measure and respond to patient behavior, and do it with less, to augment human intervention at lower cost. So I think I agreed with the range of interventions suggested by the last poll.
I would like to add that just thought about the fact that probably it's horses for courses kind of discussion. So that's why there was a wide range of answers in the third one. Of course, the situation will be very different for an orphan drug or like a statin in a market. So a very different approach could be used or can be viable at least. And this also comes back perhaps to the cautious kind of answer and this visible discrepancy between the first and the second question, that of course the obvious answer would be, as you mentioned, Paul, that the financial gains are here very much in line with better patient outcomes, so there's nothing to worry about. The two things are the same. However, it really, this discrepancy between the two questions, I think, does show that we in pharmaceutical industry, we are very much aware of this shadow of distrust over the whole industry, and we have to be really, really careful how to present and communicate and reach the target audiences, because this can have an impact on the final result.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
One comment, Paul, just wanted to throw out. So someone asked on the front end of the discussion, well, how a retail pharmacy plays a role in all of this conversation. You know, one of the things that patients are I don't have the statistics. I'm just going to go on an assumption. Patients feel very comfortable talking to pharmacists. They feel comfortable taking advice from pharmacists, or at least including that advice into their decision-making process. So the question then becomes, how does that relationship firm up over the next few years with regard to programs at the patient level? As part of that poll question, you know, do we look at other organizations to partner up with to drive these patient programs, or drive patient adherence, drive patient insights? I don't have the answers, but that is one conversation that continues to pop up behind the scenes. Are they equipped to do that? Are they willing to do that? Are they willing to, for example, go to risk regarding that? I don't know, but it is an interesting conversation in these times that I think one has to start to explore a little bit more deeply.
Okay, now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid we're out of time. That went very quickly from my perspective, and I'm really sorry, because there's a large number of audience questions that we simply haven't had time to get to. Again, I'm going to see whether or not we can go offline and maybe get some answers to those and perhaps distribute them afterwards. I don't know. John you said you were very happy. I'm not sure if our other panelists have time, but obviously we will try and get some responses. You may have noticed that one of the polls didn't work earlier. I'm just going to quickly throw it up on the screen now, just to see if we can get an answer to that. And maybe while there's still quite a lot of people on the line, this could be useful data, I think, for everybody. So this was intended to be my first question. What are the biggest barriers for investing in adherence programs and initiatives for your company? So perhaps if a few of you want to take that on. No urgency. Is it compliance and regulatory? Is it lack of senior level buy-in and financial support? Is it lack of vision of tangible short-term ROI? Is it competencies? We don't know how. So what is it? And I'm not talking about whether or not you're focusing on patient outcomes or not with this question, just on the physical barriers that you're facing. So I can see that we've got a lot of votes in there. Let's hold that open for 3 more seconds again. 3, 2, 1. Thank you so much, everybody. So let's just have a very quick look at those results. Okay, so maybe there's a biased audience here, but we certainly don't feel that the issue of urgency is the reason. It's the short-term ROI. It's going back to that financial issue, and of course the lack of senior level buy-in. A good quarter of people as well there. Competency is a significant minority there as well. So some useful perhaps information to show you all just as we finish out here. But obviously the key message I want to say as you all disappear is a huge thank you to all of our panelists. They've all given some serious time and energy to be here and share their ideas. Before you go, can you please make sure that you write into the questions box any feedback or thoughts you've got for a future session, any comments on what you've heard and what you didn't hear. Would really respect that from each of you as you go. Once again, I want to say a particular thanks to John and his team at SCIO Health Analytics for actually making today's session happen, both with the design and to make sure that we had a good audience as well, with more than 700 people signed up, as you saw earlier. If you are interested in talking about this further, you can hopefully do so at one of these 2 events happening next year. Barcelona is Europe, which is March. Philadelphia is North America, and that's in April. And of course, for being here right to the bitter end, there's a little thank you from us to get a reduced price registration fee, so you can use your code there. But once again, huge thanks to all of the panelists. I hope you've enjoyed it. Do send us your messages of love or or concern, whatever it is that got you going during the session, and we'll make sure we try and address them. Thanks very much, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.